Mr. Mayor, we are live.
Thank you. It is 6 o'clock and I welcome everyone to the special meeting of council scheduled for Wednesday, May the 18th, 2022. And I will call this meeting to order. Next, remind members of any disclosures of pecuniary interest in the general nature thereof. Seeing none noted. Moving on with item 3, presentations. This evening we have performance concepts regarding the 2022 service sharing review. I'd like to welcome Todd McDonald and Tony Quirk this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good evening, members of council and township staff. Performance Concepts is pleased to be here to offer you a briefing, perhaps support your discussion and answer any clarifying questions about this assignment. And of course, the assignment is a service sharing review initiated by your partners or potential partners at the Township of Malahide. And again, we have an overview presentation. You can stop and seek clarifications as we go. Conversely, feel free to hold your questions to the end. We're here to serve at your pleasure. We could move into the substance. A few words on the methodology of this service sharing review. It's fairly straightforward. The RFP that Performance Concepts responded to made it clear that there would be 3 substantive stages to the review. The first preliminary stage, fairly broadly formulated, was to look at service sharing opportunities and different potential models for planning, building, and bylaw enforcement services. Then to seek direction from Malahide Council and BAM Council in terms of a preferred potential option from a number of potential choices, and then to engage in this sort of deeper dive middle stage around the nuts and bolts, granular details of a potential or preferred sharing model. And assuming that was to move forward, then to construct a sample agreement, if you will, that would enumerate, encode, if you will, from a legal perspective, the characteristics of that preferred model. So we are here today to have this broader discussion with BAM Council tonight, with Malahide Council tomorrow evening, about those potential models. Thanks. If we could move forward. A bit of background. Want to make it clear to members of council and to anyone who may be following the meeting that service sharing is a win-win proposition. It's about, in this case, 2 municipalities coming together to secure superior economies of scale. The idea being that when you pool resources to deliver a certain amount of service, that your individual cost of service goes down. The long run average cost, if you will, goes down when we fund more service together. And so economies of scale, have always been the rationale behind political mergers. In this case, this is certainly not a political merger, but there are ways to secure economies of scale through service sharing that do not require that to happen. Thanks. If we could go on, I want to talk here about service sharing across Ontario. This is not a novel concept. And of course, these municipalities are involved in service sharing arrangements of a number of types already. The point to make here across Ontario is that more and more municipalities are looking at joining forces to deliver services together in order to be efficient and secure consistency of service delivery, whether it is through sharing positions as a buyer, as a seller, or as a common initiative, whether it's sharing specialized equipment or IT tools or platforms, whether it's creating a borderless service area together and deliver services across that borderless service area to secure efficiencies from erasing what might feel like artificial borders for service delivery, whether it's creating a special purpose body or shared contractor arrangements, third-party contractors. All these tools are in use across the province right now, and this review will have considered all of these potential toolkits when we talk about bylaw enforcement, building and planning services in Bayham and Malahide. Thank you. Next slide. This is not our first service sharing rodeo. We have a couple of truisms, if you will, or strategic issues that we would like you as a council to consider. First of all, service sharing by definition is all about balancing the benefits that each party receives with the cost burden that each party will have to bear. And our approach overwhelmingly is that this needs to be a win-win proposition. So I want to make it clear that while this assignment was initiated by one of the two councils, we very clearly see our job and our mandate as helping you work through options to secure a win-win arrangement for taxpayers and the councils of both municipalities. So we are here not as a servant of the Township of Malahide, but as a potential analyst to support both municipalities. The second result, if I could, just before we go too much further, the second result I want to speak to just quickly is the reality of the politics of control versus results. In any service sharing arrangement, the natural questions that a responsible council and taxpayers might want to ask themselves is, who is actually calling the shots? If one municipality is offering to sell service and the other is buying service, how do we ensure that those power relationships and the equation of control versus results is well served? We need to ensure that there is pay for say, and we need to make sure that we mitigate any control anxiety, and that we do that with formal agreements, setting out the granular details of the deal, as well as accountability mechanisms, key performance indicators that demonstrate that service level targets and service level results are being achieved by the seller and clearly secured by the buyer. So we have those strategic objectives very much in mind as we move forward here, as I know both councils will as well. Thank you. The next slide, please. So a few facts here, the as-is reality of each of the participants. Let me start with your neighbors in Malahide. Excuse me. And as you can see in this chart, we're including some key facts for building, which we know is a key priority for many reasons. The availability of staff being one of them. Bylaw, again, a key priority in both municipalities. And planning development approvals. Still a priority, but a second level priority due in no small part to the solid service being secured both in Malahide and in Bayham by your planning and engineering consultants, your outside contractors who do a lot of your work. So first of all, in terms of the staff team in Malahide, important to know that Malahide currently has an accredited chief building official, where about 0.85% of the capacity is available for building work. You'll see right next to it that chief building official is responsible. 15% of that effort goes to dealing with bylaw enforcement. You'll also see that Malahide CBO makes use of RSM building consultants who act as a registered code agency, if you will, and can supply billable hours to top up the capacity of the chief building official. In building, of course, the timeframes in Malahide, as they are in Bayham, are legislated by the province for securing building permit decision timeframes. A key element of enhanced performance moving forward in Malahide is the fact that Malahide already has the cloud permitting portal and workflow solution, the IT software that many municipalities are making use of to rationalize their delivery of building services, to make readily available an online application portal, that Malahide has this tool up and running. It is up and running, it is deployed, it is not used universally by all building applicants. We expect that would continue to be the case in a place like Bayham as well, that some applicants will opt for more traditional service delivery channels. And then finally, that Malahide funds its building process with permit fees and a Building Code Act mandated reserve. In bylaw world, a portion of the CBO oversees the model, as we mentioned. They then make use of contractor resources, MEU consulting, a billable hours service that you're very familiar with, that they utilize on an as-needed basis. They assign them file by file. The hours get billed through and are covered on a full cost recovery basis. MEU is a well-known provider of this service. They have multiple municipal clients across your portion of the province. Their business model right now is characterized by fairly common staff turnover, often younger, sometimes less experienced staff. There are legitimate questions that have been raised in our dialogue with Malahide about the longer-term service delivery stability of this model, and that will inform our work going forward. Service levels like yours, it's a complaint-driven service level. They aren't yet in Malahide in a position to do meaningful performance tracking or public reporting. For instance, there's no standardized reporting about file closure rates or the number of actionable billable days or the number of actionable days it takes to initiate an investigation of a complaint. Those sorts of key performance indicators will be necessary going forwards. And this is a property tax supported operation. And then last but not least, planning development approvals. Malahide, as you do, has a staff member tasked for development services coordination, the intake of applications and the assessment of completeness of application submissions. The township has a vacant development services senior manager position. The current CAO was a previous incumbent in that position. They utilize the services of Monteith Brown, well-known, respected planning consultancy, and again, billable hour flow through as needed using relatively low planning fees and a deposit drawdown system to pay for those billable hours. They don't yet have a go-to consistently contracted development engineering contractor. That would probably need to change in a service sharing model moving forward. Their challenges are very similar to yours. The province's new Bill 109 legislation around clawing back planning fees for slow-moving applications is obviously a risk. In the medium term, Malahide is moving towards significant greenfield housing, addressing significant greenfield housing opportunities in Springfield. This was a matter of record in the 2021 modernization review that my firm did for Malahide. And then finally, although Cloud Permit is in place and used in building, Cloud Permit has not yet been deployed for planning applications. So that is sort of, members of council, sort of the photo snapshot, if you will, of as-is preparedness in Malahide. We can move to the next slide. We've, of course, prepared a similar photo snapshot for Bayham. In this case, in Bayham, in Building World, there is currently not an accredited Building Code Act certified member of staff. There is, however, a highly experienced contractor CBO who is providing service 3 days a week, a fixed allotment of service on a billable hours recovery model. As was the case with Malahide, similar challenges. The legislated timeframes, of course, are a challenge for any Ontario municipality. Currently, Bayham does not have a portal and workflow tool solution like Cloud Permit, which in and of itself won't necessarily be a problem in a service sharing environment. And then the financial recovery model is quite similar in the sense of building fees, permit fees, plus a building reserve. When it comes to the bylaw model, your fire chief estimates approximately 30% of his capacity is allocated to overseeing the bylaw enforcement model. Our friends at MEU Consulting are again utilized on a billable hour basis as needed. And the same characteristics that were cited as a concern in Malahide are theoretically a concern here as well, in terms of questions about longer term service delivery stability. Your service level is complaint driven as well. In contrast to Malahide, though, I've looked at some of your reporting that your CAO has put in place, and we've concluded that you have reasonable performance tracking and public reporting in place. For instance, you're already able to report on closure rates for complaint-driven enforcement files. And again, your service is primarily property tax supported. And when it comes to planning, as was the case in Malahide, you have Martin delivering development services, coordination services from an experienced, long-term experience point of view. Instead of Monteith Brown, you use another highly qualified Ontario planning consulting group, the IBI group, and you employ them on a billable hours model as needed, file by file. CJDL Engineering is your contractor, your engineering contractor of record, although it's come to our attention that for recent draft plan of subdivision files, this same firm is also acting for applicants and is not available to act as the engineering consultant of record for the municipality. So it raises the interesting question, do Malahide and BAM together need to secure a consistently available engineering consulting firm to look after the interests of the municipality as contrary to the interests of applicants? And when it comes to the legislative environment, of course, BAM, like Malahide, has to be concerned about the impacts of Bill 109 and the potential clawback of planning fees for files that aren't moving against mandated timeframes that the province has put forward. We also know that you have imminent greenfield subdivision-driven growth pressures that you're facing, potential of 600 to 800 units coming through 2 draft plans that are making their way through the process. And there's an urgency to preparedness for that, to making sure you have the capacity to deal with this new experience of substantial greenfield subdivision-driven development. And then finally, like Malahide, you use a combination of relatively low planning fees plus 100% recovery of consulting effort through a deposit drawdown system, which is actually good news under Bill 109. You don't have a lot of exposure to planning fees because you've kept your planning fees low by using this deposit system. Both municipalities have those advantages. So, we've done a lot of preparatory work, and those 2 as-is slides show you sort of the fundamental similarities and some contrasts between these 2 potential service sharing partners. If we could move to the next slide, thank you. And again, members of council, as I mentioned, feel free to stop me at any point with questions of clarification. So we tried to then look at some factors that might affect the design of these potential shared service options. And some observations are certainly clear. That bylaw enforcement off the corner of the desk, if you will, by staff who have other primary duties, negatively impacts building services in Malahide. In other words, it sort of cannibalizes some of the capacity of their CBO to deal with their primary mission. And it also cannibalizes some of the capacity of your fire chief to move forward with fire's primary mission. For instance, impacting things like community risk assessment and a master fire plan. We also know, as a reality of the marketplace in Ontario, that finding accredited building staff is exceedingly difficult. It's difficult to find them. It's critically important to retain them. And it is definitely a seller's market. I can tell you from work that we do all over the province that municipalities are very concerned of having their supply of valued building staff raided by others or lost to private sector competitors. And so that seller's market does very much influence our thinking about service sharing as an opportunity to secure existing capacity. We also know that your contractor-driven planning model in Malahide and Bayham is effective in mitigating Bill 109 risk. It doesn't make a lot of sense to insource planning work to new planner staff and then create fee schedules that are at risk under Bill 109. Excuse me. The existing municipal staff provide good customer service access points in both municipalities, and we need to preserve that for building and planning applicants. And it stands to reason that securing resource and capacity, as opposed to necessarily slashing costs, is the critical objective of service sharing in a constrained municipal sector labor market. And of course, that's what we face in Ontario now, both in the municipal sector and in the private sector, is supply chain and labor shortages. So let me make it very clear what service sharing is not in this case. Shedding existing resources or staff is not appropriate. Building additional capacity on top of the well-performing staff and the properly performing consulting resources that you have is appropriate. Now, to make service sharing work, we may be involved in redeploying or reallocating some of those contract resources between municipalities, depending on whether they are a buyer or a seller. But this is definitely not a downsizing exercise. And then finally, governance and other involved aspects of service sharing can be phased in over the medium term if the short-term priority is securing buy, sell, or share resourcing capacity upgrades. Once we've addressed the labor market risks by making sure we have capacity, then we can work on things like shared service boards or special purpose bodies, if that's the will of both councils. But dealing with the important first is certainly the priority that we assume you'll want to consider as we move forward. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the mix and match components of service sharing, we certainly know that eventually the agreement, any potential agreement, will need to address service delivery mechanisms. Is it going to be a buy-sell? Is it going to be a shared arrangement? And of course, who's going to be the buyer? Who's going to be the seller? And under what circumstances are we willing to share? Governance options. We could start out with something immediate and narrowly encapsulated, like a service sharing agreement, and that would not preclude, as I mentioned, over time, moving towards a shared services board if that was deemed appropriate. Resourcing, we know that we have internal staff resources and FTEs. We know we have those already. They're not going anywhere. Not for a second are we advocating that they go anywhere. We're going to build on them as part of the platform, we would recommend. And then, of course, there's contracted service hours that we have both in planning, building, and the bylaw operations right now. The cost recovery or revenue generation toolkits, of course, we have property tax supported. We have development approvals process fees in some cases. We have a deposit drawdown model that is not linked to the Planning Act. It doesn't expose us to Bill 109. And of course, we also have the opportunity for enforcement revenues, whether those revenues come from the occasional enforcement action in building world or in bylaw enforcement world. And then finally, we have the all-important issue of measurable service levels that define a win-win. And some of those service levels are defined by the province. Bill 108 timeframes for planning applications, the Building Code Act timeframes for arriving at building permit decisions. We can also have service levels that are council mandated. Councils could decide that they want to see bylaw enforcement activity initiated on a complaint within 5 business days or less, 90% of the time. then they want to see files closed 90% of the time within 3 months. There's lots of ways that we can measure service levels going forward. Service levels can, of course, be embedded in a contractual obligation in a buy-sell relationship, or they could be a shared customer service level in a shared business model. So these components will all figure into an eventual agreement or a draft agreement if that's where the two councils want to go. Next slide, please.
Todd, before you move on, can you expand on the enforcement revenues a little bit? Like, is that really a large pool of something to fund?
No, not at all, Mr. Mayor. It's they will be enforcement revenues at best will be an infrequent, occasional occurrence. I suspect we would technically address them in an agreement, but they will certainly not be a material source of revenue. I expect both municipalities want to move towards a compliance-based civic model in bylaw, for instance. And in building world, it's often very difficult and expensive to embark on sort of legal enforcement action. So I certainly don't anticipate those being significant revenue streams. They'll simply be technical issues to be identified and dealt with in an agreement. The more common application revenue streams will be your drawdown deposit model that you pay for, you know, the Monteith Browns and the IBIs of the world, and building permit fee revenues, for instance.
Thank you for that.
Next slide, please, if we could. So, you know, when we start talking about options, of course, in some cases in planning, there are really three options in planning: a shared service delivery option, a Malahide sells and Bayham buys, or a Bayham buys, or a Bayham sells and a Malahide bays option. So it's always buy, sell, flipping between the partners, or a shared option. In the case of governance, it could be a shared services board, or it could be a purchase service agreement, again, with Malahide as a seller or with Bayham as a seller. All of these models in the planning world are going to continue to be leveraged by your competent planning technical staff and the competent execution of your contractors, both existing contractors on the planning side and perhaps a new shared contractor for development engineering services. The cost recovery tools, of course, deposit drawdowns are going to figure largely in planning, in a planning service model. We want to stay away from overblown planning fees, and we're going to be able to do so because you're already both, you both already doubled down on your deposit models, and we think that's very fortuitous, and we would not be messing around with that. And then finally, in planning world, legislated planning standards will of course be in place, and the shared services agreement that would move forward would also have something to say about, you know, the workflow timing of reacting to applications. On to the next service area. Next slide, please. In building world, again, the options in a two municipality combo, the options are pretty clear. It's either shared service delivery, or one municipality buys and the other municipality sells, or vice versa. Again, a shared services board is an option. In this case, for building, a harmonized building bylaw is probably a necessary precursor. Both municipalities, of course, have building bylaws, but they are very harmonizable, if I can say that, simply because they're both based on the legislative requirements of the Building Code Act. And of course, that would be the case in any purchase service agreement or shared servicing option. On the resourcing side, of course, we want to make sure we continue to retain our accredited building staff, which right now are on the Malahide side of the equation. But of course, we have accredited contractors in place, such as your current contracted 3-day CBO. And of course, we want to retain those resources because this is a precious market commodity right now. finding accredited billable hour capacity for building services is exceedingly difficult, and we want to make sure we maximize the use of all of the resources we currently have. Cost recovery would be through a common building permit fee schedule and through the existing reserve balances that both municipalities would bring to the table. And then finally, service levels here are primarily legislated service levels as per the Act. And on to bylaw enforcement. Next slide, please. Again, you know, the delivery options are the same that we've talked about. Governance is very similar. A board or purchase agreements, harmonized bylaws for enforcement purposes here also make a lot of sense if we're going to use the same resourcing team to deliver services in both municipalities. Of course, we'd want to continue to use some blend of staff and contractors. More on that in a minute. And revenues would primarily be property tax supported. Enforcement revenues will be infrequent and relatively less significant in this model. Service levels would be council mandated and of course probably embedded in these harmonized bylaws, and they would be also reflected in a shared services agreement between the two municipalities. On to the next slide. So in terms of evaluations quickly, when we look at the options of shared delivery, Malahide cells and BAM cells, there's some relative advantages or issues to consider associated with this. So for instance, when it comes to the strengths, all of these options would retain all of the existing competencies. In a shared model, we would retain the staff capacity in Malahide CBO. We'd also retain the shared capacity of BAM's accredited CBO, your contracted CBO. And both municipalities could leverage from the cloud permit licenses that Malahide has in place so that we could build out this technology platform for both municipalities. In a Malahide cells option, we would of course retain Malahide's accredited capacity, and in the BAM option, BAM cells option, we would retain the competencies of BAM's accredited contractor. Issues to consider, of course, there'd be some technical work to do to harmonize bylaws and fee schedules. That's certainly not insurmountable. It's just a piece of work that would need to be done. If Malahide is going to sell, it might be prudent to continue to consider redeploying or expanding the accredited contractor capacity from BAM. If Malahide was the seller, in theory, they could take over the contract for the BAM provider that you have right now. That could be expanded, and Malahide would coordinate that service. If BAM was the seller, we'd need to find a way to address the accredited capacity of the Malahide CBO. That's a little trickier to redeploy a staff position and an employee, a little more complicated than redeploying the BAM contractor. And we would have to consider how best to leverage cloud permit. So food for thought there. Let's move on to the next slide, please. In the bylaw world, in a shared delivery model, the opportunity to create a new bylaw enforcement officer position would free up the chief building official and fire chief capacity that's currently being cannibalized by doing bylaw off the corners of their desk. Compensating for some of the costs of this new bylaw enforcement officer would be a reduced reliance on contractor capacity and improved oversight of the contractor by the dedicated BLEO. And there would certainly be an opportunity for service level improvement and improved measurement of results. Under the Malahide cells option, A new BLEO would free up about 20% of the capacity of their building staff. It would also free up the capacity of BAM's fire chief, and reduced contractor capacity would be the result. And of course, the same can be said for a BAM cell option. A new BAM BLEO would free up about a third of the capacity of your fire chief to address legislative requirements. It would free up the capacity as well of Malahide CBO, and it would reduce the need for it would reduce the number of billable hours we would need from a contractor. In the issues to consider, we'd have to navigate through what would at least initially start as probably half of an FTE as an add in both budgets. We'd have to harmonize the bylaws. That would be the case no matter what. And of course, in the buy-sell relationships, depending on who the buyer was, whichever municipality became the buyer would have to fund staff a full FTE for a new BLEO. Of course, they would get a 50% cost recovery from the other municipality in that regard. So we don't see anything here as a showstopper in any way, shape, or form. And then finally on to planning. Next slide, please. The good news here is, of course, in the shared model, both internal planning techs are both going to be needed in both municipalities to act as that window into the municipality for the public. The competencies of both Monteith Brown and IBI would be retained for both municipalities. We'd get both flexibility and specialization. We wouldn't need to all of a sudden, move IBI off of the BAM files, but we would have coverage and redundancy from the Monteith Brown people if needed. The same could be said for Malahide, using Monteith Brown and using IBI as their backup. There would be an opportunity for the two municipalities to secure a new development engineering contractor, which you're both going to need given the greenfield development pressures coming at you. And both municipalities could leverage cloud permit, the cloud permit license and software moving forward. In the Malahide cells option, Malahide would retain their internal planning tech, Malahide would retain Monteith Brown, and both municipalities would use cloud permit. In the BAM cells option, BAM retains its planning tech, retains the competencies of IBI. In any of these options, we really want to make sure that we can use the capacity of the cloud permit application moving forward. And we certainly want to make sure that the existing two staffers that ably supply that window of access into the two municipalities, that we retain that. So that says things about which of these options seem appropriate moving forward. So one more slide, and then mercifully, you'll be very close to being free of me, and then we can have an interesting discussion and our team can listen carefully and take direction. We have designed a soft recommendation, if you will, or a one workable option that you may want to consider, perhaps among others. And it goes as you can see. Malahide is in a position to be the seller of building services to BAM. That would leverage their current CBO. They could take over the BAM contractor's contract. We've talked to the contractor about that. There's no problem at their end. That could be expanded to 5 days from 3 if that is deemed appropriate. There would be no erosion of building capacity because the off-the-corner erosion of capacity by bylaw is going to be dealt with in just a moment. You're going to see. So that component, we believe, works well. We also believe the shared planning model is the optimal model moving forward. Each municipality would retain their existing intake staff that do this good work at both offices. Each municipality would retain and share their contractor resources, at least for now. If together you want to go through an RFP in the future to secure a single firm, that would be an option, but it's certainly not a requirement. And we would have a phased implementation of development approvals process, best practice processes, including a deposit drawdown model for these upcoming developments that you're both going to be facing in subdivision world. And then finally, we would have the shared implementation and usage of the cloud permit tool, which brings me to the third and most interesting piece. And remember what I said at the beginning about balancing the notion of win-win and balancing control and results. We think there's an advantage systemically in having BAM become the employer of the new dedicated bylaw enforcement officer, shared 50-50, at least to begin with, because we just don't know in a complaint-based world how much workload is going to come from Malahide versus BAM. And we would have a phased bylaw harmonization. So in this model, this would not be a model with BAM being a price taker across the board. BAM would also be part of the decider side of this. So Malahide sells building, offset by BAM selling bylaw, and then the balance shared planning services. So we like that strategic balance, and we think it's a workable design factor for the two councils to consider moving forward. Malahide sells building to BAM, BAM sells bylaw to Malahide, and we have a shared planning development approvals model. Last slide. So next steps, over today and tomorrow, we want to hear the thoughts and perhaps direction from the two councils on the core elements of what a shared service option might look like. You know, we're hoping for consensus. Consensus, at least around the broad parameters, makes it easier. If we get that consensus, we'll move forward with the stage 2 detailed build out of the granular guts and specifics of the preferred option. We will then come back to you in June to talk about, you know, the guts and granular detail of the built out option. Assuming that goes well with both councils, we would then proceed to build out a sample implementation agreement, which your CAOs could then run past lawyers as required, and that your councils would be able to consider moving forward to actually make a shared services model viable. So, Mr. Mayor, members of council, thank you for your patience in listening to me. I will now blessedly be quiet and allow you to ask any questions of clarification that you may have. And depending on whether or not there are any, my team will be listening carefully to your discussion of these matters.
Thank you, Todd, for that presentation, and I found it very enlightening. Does anyone have any questions for Performance Concepts at this point? Yes, Councilor Chilcott.
Thank you. I'm not sure if it's for concepts or not, but you mentioned bylaw. We would have to, I'm guessing, harmonize our bylaws in order for one company to look after another, or can we keep them separate?
Our recommendation is that in a shared service environment, it's operationally appropriate to harmonize bylaws. We've taken a preliminary look at some of the core bylaws, and any differences didn't seem to be showstoppers from our point of view, Councillor. But operationally, if we're expecting one bylaw enforcement officer to go out there and to have credibility, we should strongly consider harmonizing the bylaws.
Thank you.
I would agree with you, Councillor Chilcott. That's one thing that I would want to know, just how different we were from our neighbors from a bylaw perspective. And would it be relatively insurmountable, or would it be, you know, something that's relatively easy to do to harmonize these two jurisdictions from a bylaw perspective?
Once more, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillor, the next stage of the engagement, if we are to proceed to that, we would certainly take a much more detailed, granular look at exactly what bylaw harmonization would look like. And we would come back with specific answers to the councillor's global question when we come back in June. So again, I want to emphasize, this is not a take it or leave it decision that council is making tonight. It's simply a decision to proceed to the next level of investigation. And I have certainly made note that we would be sure to address the councillor's questions about the mechanics of bylaw harmonization.
Yes, Deputy Mayor Weiser.
Yes, thank you through you, Mr. Mayor. Just sort of stuck on the bylaw here. I just had a couple of clarification questions. Thank you again for the report. I found it very, very interesting. I noticed in Malahide, the services there are approximately a quarter of what they're reporting. And then for Bayham, we're sitting at about 33%. The recommendation is a 50-50 split, but I'm just curious as to that's a 50-50 split of a full-time bylaw officer. Is that correct? I just want to confirm that I have that correct.
So, Councillor, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillor. Services delivered in both municipalities by a portion of one of your full-time staff, and then a bunch of billable hours from MEU. And so in the case of Malahide, their CBO estimated, and his point was, look, I'm super busy in building world. I deal with bylaw enforcement world off the corner of my desk. It probably takes about 15% of my time, and I'm not sure that I'm giving good oversight to the work done by MEU. So we haven't necessarily said that the 15, and in the case of the fire chief, the chief mentioned that about a third of his capacity, plus a bunch of hours from MEU, are the totality of the service. Now, we have gathered a bunch of information about historically, how many billable hours of MEU's time each municipality has taken, and what their historic level of complaint-driven cases are. We'll bring all that information forward in a detailed way in the next stage of the review. It could well be that at the beginning of a year where you decided to share a bylaw enforcement officer, the upfront budgeting would be 50-50, but it might be adjusted by a reconciliation at year end based on how much service in any given year was consumed in Malahide versus the amount that was consumed in Bayham. In the absence of a forecast at the beginning of the year that we have any confidence in, we would recommend that you start at 50-50. But again, year-end adjustments are certainly possible in the agreement based on actual effort expended by the bylaw enforcement officer and by any residual amounts from the MEU contractor. So, we don't anticipate, indefinite cross-subsidization of the position by one municipality or the other. And frankly, I don't know who would be subsidizing who. That could vary from year to year. I hope that answer was helpful.
Very much so. Thank you very much for that clarification. Just one more supplementary there, Mr. Mayor?
Carry on.
Yes, okay. Thank you through you, Mr. Mayor, then. Yes, so I really like this because bylaw is one of these challenging areas in every smaller tier municipality, evidently. But just to confirm, there really is no record taking that you're seeing through Malahide. Like, is there any way to determine their intake? So we don't really know. So like you said, I love the clarification that at the end there would be a reconciliation if we needed to. And yeah, so that does clarify a lot for me. Thank you very much for that.
Certainly, Councillor, to you, Malahide does count complaints, so they know how many cases they have. What they aren't yet doing that your administration does a better job of is confirming that complaints are closed. So as the CBO in Malahide informed us, he's with only 15% of his capacity available to deal with oversight of bylaw. He knows the invoices they're processing. He knows how many hours they're paying for from MEU. He's just not convinced that these files are being closed or not being closed on a timely basis. A recent council report that you've received from your CAO had reasonably good data in it about closure rates of files. Going forward, I think any shared BLEO is going to have to docket time, at the file level so that we know which files are consuming how many billable hours of both the BLEO as well as from the contractor. And that'll give us, the information we need at the end of year, for instance, to do a reconciliation between the two municipalities.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Any additional comments or questions? Yeah, Councilor Froese.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Do we know the population of Malahide?
9,000.
Oh yeah,
5,000?
yeah, Councillor. Certainly I don't know the new 2020 census number, but we certainly have easy access to the up-to-date census supported populations from both municipalities.
They're slightly bigger than us, Councilor Froese. I believe 9,000. Thomas?
9,308, 21
Thank you.
census.
Okay. Seeing nothing further, my comments are, I think there are advantages to both municipalities with this proposed workable model for consideration. I can see, if you want to start it with bylaw enforcement, it would put perhaps Malahide back into a more transparent mode. Not that they're not transparent now, but by having that reporting and closure statistic at the end of the year. From a building services point of view, we currently don't have an in-house CBO. We have a contractor, but we don't have the cloud-based portal to work from. And that gives us an advantage of moving forward. And I do like the shared planning arrangement. It gives us access to more resources down the road here. So I'm really interested in seeing this fleshed out a little more in June, but that's my opinion. And I wait to see what council has to say about that. So Councillor Chilcott, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with you. It looks like it could be beneficial to both of us. We definitely need some more bylaw, although we are doing well with it. It always seems to be the top of the list of the residents. So I'm sure it's the same as for Malahide. So getting that taken care of would help. And yeah, I think this is a good step in the right direction.
Thank you for that. Councillor Donald.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I would like to say that this is a great report, gives us a lot of information to consider, and I like the Malahide cells, Bay and cells, shared planning. It's all needs to be worked out some more, definitely, but it looks like it's a really, as you said, sir, a win-win situation, and I would like to see this move forward.
Thank you for that. Councillor Froese.
I guess I'm looking forward to a further detailed report too. To me right now, math just doesn't make sense because our building inspector, talking to him yesterday, he's here 3 days a week and he's swamped. So to go down to a half time, I don't know how that would work. So, and also is we have a halftime bylaw inspector now, correct? And for us to split a bylaw inspector with a community that is 2,000 more people, I guess to me, the math doesn't make sense right now, but I look forward to a further report.
Yeah. To clarify, Dan, Harry's is 1/3 of his time or 30% of his time is on bylaw enforcement, not 50%. The Malahide Cells building suggests not only leveraging increased capacity from their CBO, but also perhaps taking over and using our contractor or a contractor to enhance building services.
That's correct, Mr. Mayor. We don't envision any reduction in any capacity of service that Bayham is currently receiving. The transfer of your 3-day-a-week CBO into the Malahide column could lay the groundwork for potentially expanding the usage of that experienced individual to 5 days a week, and therefore being able to deploy at least as much firepower, if you will, to the anticipated growth in building permit volumes moving forward. And the new BLEO, if we want to think of it that way, would represent something like 1,800 hours of 1,800 service hours of annual capacity, whereas right now, you're achieving 1/3 of that from your fire chief, and of course that third is then not available to deal with fire issues. So one of the benefits to consider when you go to the BLEO model is the improved capacity of the fire chief to lead the fire department and to deal with priorities that he hasn't yet been able to address because of constraints on his time.
I do agree with you, Councillor Froese, that we need to see some more flesh on the bones here to see how this works out. But no, I think the approach sounds good to me at this point. Yeah, Councillor Froese?
It sounds good to me too. So I guess just a further question is, for what reason, what is the main reason we're trying to do this? To save money or to simply share staff? Or is there another reason?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor, in one of my earlier slides, I commented on the municipal labor market that we face right now, and that building officials, for instance, are like solid gold. If you've got them, you got to hold on to them. And if you've got a registered code agency, a contractor, you want to hold on to them as well. And because you're not going to go out to the market and just instantly find accredited building staff that are just, beating down your door. They're wanted everywhere. So we need to secure the resources we've got and use them in common to meet our mutual priorities. So I'm not sure that anything here will be a net saver of money. As we adopt a new bylaw enforcement officer, we'll use less of the contractor to less billable hours from the contractor, and we'll sort of minimize the new cost of your half or your fraction. But I think it's primarily to secure capacity to do the necessary work in an era where it's not that easy to secure the capacity on your own.
Deputy Mayor Weiser.
Yes, thank you through you, Mr. Mayor. Just a comment. I'm very encouraged by this report. The idea of sharing services, particularly in planning when we're looking at some pretty significant growth, and just being able to access other professionals as well, and getting some support for our staff is going to be awesome. I think one of the comments that we hear quite often here is that we do need a dedicated bylaw officer that, and again, as Todd has outlined, this will definitely free up our fire chief to concentrate more on fire. So I'm really encouraged by this model. I do agree with Councillor Froese. It'd be nice to see a little more meat on the bones, and I would be very supportive of continuing with this with these recommendations. It's just a comment. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. And again, just to clarify, a dedicated bylaw enforcement officer, yes, but I don't know if we have capacity
Shared.
requirements for. Yes, now that's the way to deal with it. Thank you.
Shared, that's
All
correct.
right.
Sorry, Mr. Yes.
All right, you look at something like the City of London, whereas one bylaw enforcement officer services 16,000 people. All right. Gives you some of the math to think about. Okay. Anything else from anyone else? Well, again, Todd, thank you very much for that presentation and overview. I think I'm hearing some consensus from people. I have a motion here that I will read out and see if anyone's interested in moving and seconding. That the presentation for performance concepts regarding the 2022 service sharing review be received for information, and that council provide direction to performance concepts regarding the preferred option. You got a better one than that, Thomas?
I do
Please.
actually. While council was having discussion, I drafted up a motion based upon what I thought council may go with. So if
Thank
you'll
you.
indulge, I can read that for you.
I wish you would.
That the presentation from performance concepts read 2022 service sharing review be received for information, and that council requests performance concepts to proceed with the development of a potential service sharing model where Malahide sells building services, Bayham sells bylaw enforcement services, and Malahide and Bayham share planning services, and that the requested model be presented to council in June 2022.
Okay, has everyone got that? And if so, I would entertain a mover and seconder, please. Moved by Councillor Chilcott, seconded by Deputy Mayor Weisler. All in favor?
Counselor Donald,
Yes.
Counselor Froese,
Yes.
Counselor Chilcott,
Yes,
Deputy Mayor Weisler,
Yes,
Mayor Ketchabah.
Yes,
Carried.
thank you. Which leads us to the confirming bylaw. That the confirming bylaw number 2022-036 be read a first, second, and third time and finally passed. Mover and seconder, please. Councillor Donald will move, Councillor Chilcott will second, all in favor.
Counselor Donald,
Yes.
Counselor Froese,
Yes.
Counselor Chilcott,
yes,
Deputy Mayor Weisler,
yes,
Mayor Ketchabah.
Yes.
Carried.
Finally, that the council meeting be adjourned at 7:02 PM. Mover and seconder, please. Councillor Donald and Councillor Chilcott will second, all in favor.
Counselor Donald,
Yes.
Counselor Froese,
Yes.
Counselor Chilcott,
yes.
Deputy Mayor Weisler,
yes.
and Mayor Ketchabah.
Yes.
Carried.
Okay, thank you all for joining us this evening. We'll see you tomorrow.